He said he'd like to do it, but he's like, I don't think Irish people would like it.
No, it's too much for them. Like, welcome back to Sikistan. Welcome back to another video. And welcome back to another video where we talk about something ye are always talking about. So, something that's been popping up in the live streams over the last kind of 2 or 3 months is the hybrid athlete. Guys out there like Fergus Crawley, Clink, Nick Bear, all these guys who are lifting heavy enough weights, running fast enough, running times, and then also being in phenomenal shape. So the questions we're kind of commonly getting are, is this a good way of training? Is this a sustainable way of training? Is this something I should look into myself? And then what are the kind of long-term implications of being this kind of hybrid style athlete? In my opinion, it's a phenomenal way of training. It's a way of kind of getting into a level of competitiveness both with yourself and against other people that maybe a lot of people don't have open to them at the moment. It's very similar to kind of like what I consider to be like a decathlon style training where you're having to do multiple things at the same time. We often think of the hybrid athlete as being like a super total athlete who are weightlifting and powerlifting. Although those sports are different and they're different in their demands, they're still very, very similar. Whereas if you take this style of hybrid athlete, those two types of demands really couldn't be more different from each other.
So the big part of why the hybrid athlete is such a novelty for people to watch and it's such a novel goal for people to chase after is due to its difficulty. The nature of its actual event is kind of heavily intertwined with the physiology of both of these events. So we have a very, or as much as you can possibly manage, a high strength event and then a high endurance event. And the two of these are basically pulling in opposite directions, or as much as possibly can in terms of physiology. So in the early 1990s, I think 1994, the interference effect was something that was first coined by sports scientists, I should say, whereabout that does conditioning and high endurance work interfere with our strength and power work. Now, you would say obviously, of course it does, and the answer is yes, it does. So there's interference effect between, when you do a lot of strength work, does it negatively pull away from your conditioning, and does doing a lot of conditioning work pull away from your strength work? So if you imagine there's this kind of pool of energy available for you. In 1938, some Hungarian scientists, I believe, coined a term called adaptation energy. So adaptation energy is the energy available for you to deal with stressors. Now, these are stressors like from cold, psychological stress, breaking up with your girlfriend stress, falling into a river, running, strength training. All these stresses in some ways are very, very similar to your body, and there's a limited pool of energy available for you to adapt to these new stressors. So if you go into a cold pool or you go into the ocean every day, you stress yourself. It provides things like environmental hormesis. You incur a series of adaptations in your body, and then your body funnels in through this levels of this adaptation energy you have in store, depending on how much other stressors you've dealt with. And then it slowly builds up these levels of adaptation and channels these into these stressors that you're dealing with. However, you also have a very limited amount of these stressors. And obviously, if you go too far with these stressors, you don't have enough adaptation energy and you might kill yourself or get injured. So there's a variety of different things involved with the kind of interference effect and this kind of hybrid athletes, or these kind of strength endurance events that we get. So there's a couple of different things. We have, for example, just levels of muscle mass. We know when you get to strength training that higher levels of muscle mass is related to your ability to potential to produce more force, and the more force we can produce, the better we can do in strength events, so like squat, bench and deadlift, for example, which is commonly the ones we see people do this with. Then we have things like, which are a little bit more nuanced, but actually probably a little bit more severe in its negative effects from, for example, for running to our strength, which is, for example, our type of muscle fibers. So we would have obviously slow twitch muscle fibers heavily involved in the endurance training, and then in the strength training we're looking at preferably more levels of fast twitch muscle fibers, maybe type 2X or type 2A most likely. So when we do a lot of strength training, while we don't get an increase in the number of fibers, we will get a fiber type shift, and if we do a lot of endurance training, we'll get more fiber type shift, but in the opposite direction. So we'll get them going from type 2A, for example, to type 1, to slow twitch fibers, which is not good for strength training in general, but it obviously is productive for endurance. And then obviously, conversely, the more fast twitch muscle fibers we are, the less well adapted and less well suited we will be for these endurance events. Then we have things like literally just the amount of training time involved in running is huge. Anyone knows that if you're doing any kind of endurance event, you'll have a huge amount of hours of literally just doing your sport, and you kind of have to do that. There's a certain minimum requisite number of hours you just have to be doing your endurance for, whether it's running or swimming. They just take up a lot of time. And this time then we don't have for training, because unless you're a full-time athlete, if you're working full-time, you've only a certain number of hours, and again, that certain number of hours, your 40, 50 hours a week of work is taken away from your adaptation energy. It's a stressor on your life. So this time available for you is very restricted, because you also not only need to do these endurance events, which take a lot of time and are high volume training, you also have to do quite a reasonable amount of strength training, which might be somewhere in the region of maybe 10 hours of endurance a week, and then we might look like 5 hours or less of strength training. But not only do these take a lot of time in general of training in the gym, we also have these negative adaptations. So we have to overcome the psychological stress. So the psychology of approaching an endurance event, so running something like a mile as fast as possible, or running a marathon and then doing a powerlifting total. The psychology behind both of these is vastly different. The level of hype, how long this hype will be sustained for, your enjoyment of both of these events, the likelihood that you are well suited to both of these and are able to switch from one to the other is very, very difficult, and it's quite unlikely, something it's very, very hard to get used to. Then we have the kind of injury effect of this kind of training. So endurance training is very prone to injuries, especially repetitive strain injuries. It's something that is very, very common. Whereas with powerlifting, the injuries we see are maybe, depending on the level you get to, are a little bit more acute events. So they're injuries from a poor lift, or they could also be repetitive strain injury. So if we've RSIs coming from our strength training and RSIs coming from endurance, we're almost doubling our amount of repetitive strain injury potential. Then finally, the last kind of issue, and it's not really part of the interference effect, but it is something that is very notable, and it is something that is very important to understand, is that the knowledge for this kind of training for most people is very, very limited. You need a great base and understanding of both of these disciplines, which is not something you'd often get. Then you also have to understand how to coach people to do this, then take them along a periodized plan like you would have with any other sport or training plan. And so the knowledge is still something that is part of this kind of interference effect, although not physiologically, psychology from you or your coach.
So we have a few people on the Sika books or in the stable at the moment who are this kind of hybrid style athlete, right? And we get a lot of people asking about this in general. How do I start training? Is this a good training modality for me? There's a number of things you need to think about first, right? So before you kind of take the dive into saying, I want to run a 17-minute 5K and squat 200 kilos or whatever it is you want to do, you really do need to consider like these few things. So the first thing you need to consider is that most of the time you see high-end hybrid athletes or people who are doing something like a 5-minute mile and a 500-pound squat in the same day, they're not hitting PBs with that kind of training. Most of the time the squat number has been hit far in advance, the running number has been hit far in advance, and these two values, the main challenge is just hitting them on the same day, being in the same shape like concurrently for both of these paths, so you can achieve that on the same day. If you're somebody in your training and you want to do that, so you want to do the 500-pound squat and the 5-minute mile in the same day, it's very, very unlikely that the best way of you getting there, or the easiest way of you getting there, would be to start training both of those immediately at the same time for them to peak at the same time right now. This is more than likely going to be a multi-year process. It will probably be a lot easier over those number of years if you periodize out your training, and rather than having it as this concurrent block, which a concurrent block would probably work well in the last 6 months of training. But for those preliminary years, you're mainly trying to push your squat up for a while, then you'll take a few months and you'll transition and push your run times down, then you'll push your squat numbers up, your run times down. In my case, when I was attempting this, the squat number had been hit maybe 2.5 or 3 years earlier, been hit multiple times, so it hadn't just been hit once. Those running numbers had been like weekly running numbers for years and years of my life in a previous sporting career. So none of these things are the kind of main challenge. If you're looking at this now as a modality and thinking, oh, I'd really like to hit those numbers and I'd like to do them at the same time, you're probably better just taking a step back and going and hitting one of them first, then hitting another one, and then trying to hit both of them concurrently. The next big challenge is, or the next common question we get is this going to put like a glass ceiling on my numbers? Is there going to be a certain limit that if I hadn't been training both at the same time, would I be able to squat more weight? Would I be able to run faster times? And the answer is almost certainly yes. You would be able to squat more weight if you just went and squatted. You would be able to run faster times if you just went and run. But there are definite benefits to this way of training. There's a reason it's getting so popular. There's a reason so many people see it and are appealing to this form. And these are, firstly, these athletes are very rarely in poor shape. Most of the time they're quite lean, they hold a bit of muscle mass, they look good, and for health reasons they're usually very, very healthy. They hold a good bit of muscle mass and they have high levels of aerobic fitness. The next thing is, most of these athletes are strong. Like if you go into most normal gyms in the world and they're hitting those numbers for squats or deadlifts or whatever, they're very, very, very respectable numbers, at least the people at the kind of high end. And the last thing is, most of these running numbers are fast enough for you to do almost anything in your normal life and be fitter than 99% of the people in the room or the people in the club or wherever it is you are. You're a very, very legitimate athlete and you're doing some pretty cool things if you're able to go down this form of training. The last point I will make is on health. I mentioned earlier, this is a very healthy way of training, or these athletes tend to be very healthy. If you're pushing for very high end numbers, if you're pushing to be the fastest and the strongest, you're probably not. It's like in any elite sporting case, you're probably not going to be the healthiest. Now, you'll be healthier than a lot of the population, but a certain trade-off has to be given for those last few percent where health is certainly going to be impacted, whether that is through psychological stress and your sleep being impacted because of it, whether it's through just general physiological stress and you having heightened cortisol levels, whether it's through stress from outside factors. There's definitely a number of things to take into account.
Do you want to talk about the drugs?
Yeah.
Okay. One or two other things I just needed to mention as well in the physiology aspect is things like, your motor unit recruitment and how fast you do and the sequence you do these in. For example, when you are running, your body learns this process of conserving energy, conserving how fast motor units are recruited, and you get into this this habit of recruiting muscle fibers and sequence them in a certain pattern. It also affects things like there's different responses to hormonal responses from training. There's from strength training, hormonal responses from endurance events. For example, if it's like cold water swimming, you're going to have a lot of cortisol, a lot of kind of negative or temporarily negative hormones, or a negative light, I suppose. So this kind of brings us on to the fact that in these events, like we always talk about, we're not, accusing anyone, or we're not saying that it's mandatory. It's just kind of a matter of fact is that anything we do anything we do anything we do in a sporting context can almost always, and I'm going to say 100% of the time, be improved by use of performance enhancing drugs. So in these cases, some of these athletes are very, very likely using performance enhancing drugs, and there's nothing wrong with that. They're not competing against anyone, they're not competing in drug tested events, they're just doing this for themselves and to impress other people, and they are certainly impressing me. So the use of performance enhancing drugs in this context are hugely beneficial. If you imagine this kind of small little pool of adaptation energy we have when we don't use performance enhancing drugs, even if you've trained for 10-15 years and you've great sleep and you've great nutrition, you've great genetics, you take performance enhancing drugs with all of these things, on top of that our pool of adaptation energy gets a lot bigger. Then if you also imagine we have two kind of conical flasks here, and this is our endurance and our strength, and we fill this with our adaptation energy, our ability to maintain the fullness of our conical flasks on performance enhancing drugs is much better. So if we approach the training, like Fitz said, with a periodized effect, and we go, okay, 6 months of this year, I'm going to get my squat up to 20 kilos above what I want to do on race day. So you get to that point, and you get far in excess of that, your ability to maintain 90% or more of that squat will be so much easier. The level of effort you'll have to put into that, your quality of muscle mass you gain there, and your ability to maintain that muscle mass using performance enhancing drugs will be so much better when you go into your endurance phase. So you'll be able to do that a lot simpler. You'll be able to put a lot less effort into your squatting or bench, your deadlifting, or whatever your strength event of this hybrid athlete is. To be able to maintain that as much as possible will be so much easier. Physiologically, psychologically, both of these will be quite simpler, so you'll get injured less. your tendons, ligaments, muscles, energy available for you, your psychology going into events, approaching strength, your ability to tolerate pain. So your higher testosterone levels are related to ability to tolerate pain, and these events are certainly painful, especially the kind of higher speed ones or faster ones. All of these things are heavily related to performance enhancing drugs, and all these benefit quite well from PEDs. So just note from these events that it's certainly a very, very useful thing, and it's probably why you see a lot of them, unless they're an absolute freak of nature, carry a shitload of muscle mass. Now, it's very interesting because I think some of these are certainly possible for a talented athlete without performance enhancing drugs. But when you see people like, I know for example, Alex Viada is very open about his use of performance enhancing drugs, and that's why you see him doing like triathlons and being incredibly jacked and still very strong. I'm not up to date on Alex in the last few years, but he was at one point in phenomenal shape, you know. So if you see some of these athletes who are hugely jacked, and I mean like 10% body fat,
obnoxiously jacked,
huge pecs for some reason,
yeah,
for whatever reason, it's probably a good indicator of them using it. I'm sure most people could guess that, but ultimately, like for most things, you know, it's still incredibly impressive and it doesn't take away from it. But just note that is obviously part of that, like all things in sport and physical stuff.
We have a program for hybrid athletes coming out. This program is going to deal with running, so running distances 3K, 1K and 1 mile, and then it will be looking at squatting goals, pressing goals and deadlifting goals. That will probably be coming out in around 3 or 4 months time. So if it is something you're interested in, just keep an eye on this space. It'd be great if you dropped a comment down below, because then we'll get us, the little programming fairies, to work a little faster on it. And yeah, if you have more questions about hybrid athletes or about athletes in general, pop them in the comments down below and Owen will macarena you out of here.